All right. Good evening. I'm glad somebody else said it, and I didn't have to, but good evening to the rest of you. Welcome to People's University. I don't think I have to tell these people to silence their cell phones because they were responsible enough to drive on the snowy roads. They're responsible enough to silence their cell phones.
What's a cell phone?
There you go. Next class, Thursday, January 13th at 7 p.m. We'll have class 7. Dr. Korkek Hale, Associate Professor of History at the Zanesville campus of Ohio University, will be talking about the Reagan and Gorbachev era. She'll discuss the situation before Reagan and Gorbachev came to power, the role of the personalities and how they evolved over the terms, and the impact of Gorbachev's reforms, the transformation of the Warsaw Pact, and the reunification of Germany, and also the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that's next Thursday, January 13th at 7 p.m. And then on Thursday, January 18th, she'll also be teaching our last class. It's class 8, Epilogue, Duck and Cover. Is the Cold War over? Which I heard somebody asking right before this program started. So make sure you come to that one. You'll find out if the Cold War really is over. Dr. Hare will be discussing uneasy partners in the first Gulf War, the momentary seduction of the democratic peace theory, the structural conflict between big powers, the legacies left by NATO and Russia, including Cold War armaments, nukes, and biological warfare, control of resources, and power displays. That's Thursday, January 18th, 2 weeks from today at 7 p.m. And then the next week at Lunch with Books, Tuesday, January 11th at noon. This guy over here, local history researcher Ed Phillips, will tell us about Wheeling's Athenaeum, also known as Lincoln's Bastille. If you're a Civil War buff, you'll like that program, so please come to it. That's next Tuesday, January 11th at noon. All right, tonight's instructor, Dr. Joe Laker, is Emeritus Professor of History at Wheeling Jesuit University and a board member of West Virginia Independence Hall Foundation. Following his graduation from Marian College with a degree in history, he spent 2 years teaching English conversation in Kyoto, Japan. He returned home to seek advanced degrees at Indiana University and received his PhD in history in 1975. You're dating yourself there, Joe. Just tell him you have your PhD. He spent the next 33 years teaching at Wheeling Jesuit University. Please welcome Dr. Joe Laker. Oh, and if you responded to our poll about the Wheeling Symphony Orchestra doing a program on the Thursday, January 20th, we had programmed that, and it's in our brochure, but the symphony just had to cancel all of their January programs, including our Lunch with Books, so that's no longer on the brochure, but we're hoping to reschedule in May or June for that. So again, please welcome Dr. Joe Laker.
And I get to the map by moving it over, right?
Yeah, go to the map by going here.
Okay, that's okay.
Forgot I had to put that up. There you go.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks for coming out. I had no idea how many people would show up, but more than I thought. And thanks to Aaron for a very nice introduction as usual. And for Sean for arranging me for the opportunity to give this kind of talk. In 1948, Eric Blair, although his alias, his pen name was George Orwell, brought out a book called 1984, which dealt with a totalitarian society, and he used the Soviet Union as his model. And that book and a number of other kind of anti-utopian novels sort of set the tone for how most Americans looked at the USSR. It was a closed society. It was very difficult to find good information about what was going on in that society. It didn't welcome many visitors. And even our diplomats found themselves often confined and circumscribed by the authorities, so that it was difficult for us to get good, valid information about the Soviet Union. Well, in 1970, one of the Russian dissidents who had fled from the Soviet Union a man by the name of Andrei Amalrik, came out with a book called Will the Soviet Union Survive to 1984? So he was playing off of Orwell's novel by reversing the 48 to 84. And when that book came out, I think in graduate school, I laughed. I thought, oh, how silly that this book is. And he thought that the Soviet Union collapsed for two reasons. One was internal problems, and secondly, war with China. And I thought, it's not going to collapse. It's really a solid empire, and it's going to go on and on for a long time. Well, this communist society had lots of supporters throughout the world. So in many different countries, there were created communist parties, and they often took direction from Moscow. And this was especially true in the early days, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, because they were often financially dependent upon Moscow in financing their movements. But these were people who were true believers in the Marxist movement. And I would say that the Soviet leadership also remained true believers up until the mid-1980s. And after that, the vast majority of Soviet citizens, I think, have lost faith or confidence in that kind of system. And so you have this Soviet ideology, which is connected with Marxism, Leninism, and it's popular even in Western countries. So, for instance, in France, there were 1.5 million members of the Communist Party in the 1950s and 60s. And in France, there were about 300,000. And these communist parties went back to the 1920s, shortly after the Russian Revolution. So that throughout the world, in many independent states, there were in various independent communist parties, or at least communist parties that competed for votes and for power. And Moscow could use these communist parties very often to advance its own interest. The United States set up it had its own philosophy and its own hopes and program, which was connected up with the kind of liberal order that was created in the world following World War I. And those ideals were best expressed in Wilson's 14 points. That was his program about how the world could be a really better place after the dreadful World War I. Well, of course, as we know, the United States didn't even join the League of Nations, which was the 14th point. And we failed to create the kind of world without war that Wilson had so wanted. And we had an even more terrible war, World War II. But both of these, should I say, ideologies and philosophies and approaches to creating a good world order had to also compete with one, I think, that is even stronger, still stronger today. It was stronger back then, and that is nationalism. So nationalism, the belief in one's nation and wanting to advance its interests, influenced all the Western countries, and it certainly influenced the Soviet Union. So Stalin was certainly a strong Marxist-Leninist, but he was also a nationalist. And what was good for Russia or the USSR was, in his mind, good for the Marxist-Leninist movement. But nationalism was, in many ways, much more important to him than the communist movement itself. The communist movement was a method to sort of enhance Russia. Now, during this time, right before, I want you to think of, let's say, a theory that sort of came out in the early 20th century, and it was founded by, I'm going to mention three different people. One of them is an American, Alfred Thayer Mahan. He lived mainly in the 19th century. He was born in 1840, died in 1914. And he was a naval scholar and a member of the US Navy for something like 40 years. Taught at Annapolis and also at the Naval War College. His most important book was called The Influence of Sea Power on History. And this book was very influential in the United States in creating a modern, powerful Navy. But it was powerful and influential in all of the major countries that wanted to create a powerful Navy. So it was like the Bible for the German Naval College, for the British, for the French, for the Italians, for the Russians, for the Chinese, for the Japanese. They all used that book and thought of it as a very important book. And it was mainly about how Britain came to dominate the seas. Well, the second one was an Englishman by the name of Alfred Mackinder, who was born in 1861, died in 1946. And he and a German by the name of Karl Haushofer both came up with this approach to politics called geopolitics. And they both talked about the heartland theory versus the periphery theory. And the heartland was essentially Eurasia. And who could dominate Eurasia, the heartland, they felt could dominate the world. They would become so powerful. And at one time, his little comment was, "He who rules Eastern Europe," and by that he meant Eurasia, "commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island," meaning the whole Eurasia continent. "Who rules the world island commands the world." Now, set up in opposition were thinkers who said, no, they can be contained by controlling the periphery, all the surrounding areas. And Great Britain controlled the periphery with its huge empire and its powerful navy. And on numerous occasions, it has stepped in to fight wars in Europe with allies to try to prevent any one country from dominating the heartland, so to speak. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was Napoleon. And they, with their allies, managed to finally defeat Napoleon after a very severe struggle. Then the next big contestant was Germany. Twice in the 20th century, Germans became a threat. And the third was Russia. So the British were always concerned about Russia and Russia's threat to their empire and the need to contain Russia. So we want to contain them in the Balkans, in the Red Sea. We don't want them to get out of the Black Sea with their navy into the Mediterranean. We don't want them to break through to threaten India. We don't want them to break through and threaten in the Far East. And so they made alliances and they worked to try to contain them. One of the most famous novels of India, called Kim, written by Rudyard Kipling, is about a young man who participates as a spy for the British in what was known as the Great Game. So the Great Game was this attempt to try to use diplomacy and military power to try to contain the Russians and protect the empire. And even after the Russians, a follow-up, and this is not a novel, but an academic work by a man by the name of Peter Hopkirk, who's written 3 books about the British trying to prevent the threat to the empire through the big game. And it's not just by the Russians, but also by the Germans during the 19th and 20th century. So this, talking about heartland versus periphery, After 1945, my question would be, did the United States become the defender of the periphery, so to speak, with its alliances, with its means to try to prevent the Russians from breaking out? And you can sort of see this map here about US military bases. I came across some left-wing internet site that said the United States had something like 800 different military facilities around the world. And they were placed in places where Americans could come to dominate the resource production of all these countries. And you can sort of see that this, I'm not sure that this is the same, this map comes from the same website. I tried to check that, but I haven't been able to determine that. But you can see where they talk about 119 military facilities in Germany, 120 in Japan. Now, I've lived in Japan for 4 years. I know of some of the big bases, but there are very few big bases. So are they talking about just radar installations where they might have 1 or 2 people? So probably, you know, that's why you get up to 800 maybe. But 800 still seems like an incredible number. But you can sort of see that all around, sort of around the Soviet Union, China, these red and even orange places are places where America has facilities to try to monitor what's going on in China and in the Soviet Union through watching with their, you know, planes, spy planes, now spy satellites, with radar installations, with all kinds of other means. So that was just one of the things that sort of struck me, is that perhaps the United States has taken over that role. And it fits in with George Kennan's long telegram sent to the State Department in 1947. It's a very famous telegram, about 8,000 words telegram. I can't imagine writing a telegram. A guy had to type 800 words and for a cable. Later on, it was produced as a book, and it's about sources of the Soviet behavior. And in that particular book, he talks about containment. We have to find ways to contain the Russians until finally the Russians are transformed within or collapse and become less of no real threat any longer. And that sort of, again, fits in. Now, he would probably object if I said, yeah, you made the United States part of the protector of the periphery. But it sort of fits. Now, in trying to maintain this kind of control, though, we have, for a long time, had lots of violence in the 20th century. And even after World War II, some people called the Cold War the long peace, because there was no major war between the United States and Russia, or between really powerful states. And Gary Capel talked a little bit about that in the past when he mentioned that although there were proxy wars, we got involved in various pretty big wars, but they weren't directly with the Soviet Union, like Korea and Vietnam. But there have been something like 285 conflicts, armed conflicts throughout the world since 1945. Now, the United States hasn't been involved in all of them, but certainly we were involved in a number of them on one side or the other. And very often, if we saw our interests threatened in a particular area of the world in an armed conflict, we would find that the Soviet Union often was supportive of the other side. So they were part of that kind of huge struggle that was going on between ourselves and the Soviet Union. We created, and if you think of the Russians, one of the things that Gary talked about was Russian insecurity. Believed that they weren't safe because they had faced numerous invasions. Think of Napoleon, think of the 2 German invasions. the Japanese attacks, that they have a real problem with believing that they are safe and secure. And they wanted to create a sort of a bunch of similar states with similar philosophies, client states, that would be good allies and would surround them and provide safety for them. And you might think of those in Eastern Europe, that part of the Soviet bloc, as that security area. Well, the United States, if you were a Soviet, you were looking at the map, you'd say, wow, the Americans really are doing a number on us. In Europe, there was NATO, a defensive alliance. We called it a defensive alliance. They could look at it as an offensive alliance to contain us and perhaps even roll back our security corridor. Almost all the European states were members, including the United States and Canada. An attack on one NATO country was an attack on all of them. So we were committed to going to war to defend our native allies. In the Middle East, there was CENTO, C-E-N-T-O. It wasn't nearly as powerful. And we didn't actually join CENTO officially, but we were always supportive of it, and we gave it money and support. But among the countries that belonged were Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Pakistan, and the UK. UK because of past connections with the area. And you can sort of see there's a belt of the south there of the Soviet Union that would be protected. In Southeast Asia, there was CETO, a Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, in which we pledged to defend them. And this CENTO lasted from 1953 to 1977. CETO lasted from 1954 to 1977. Okay, it's a long period of time. And included in CETO were the US, Great Britain, France, Australia, the Philippines, New Zealand, Thailand, and Pakistan. Didn't include Indochina, which was then in the throes of the war. And later on, after it was, well, even before it was defunct, it was never as strong an alliance as NATO. But even before it was defunct, Southeast Asian nations had created another organization called ASEAN, which still exists today. It was created in the 1960s, and it was to bring about economic cooperation, but also some security to Southeast Asian nations, and it was directed primarily at containing China. And ASEAN still exists. It's still quite strong. Included in ASEAN now are 11 different countries in Southeast Asia, almost all the Southeast Asian countries. And if I, let's see, can find the way to do this. No, of course. The arrow, right, thank you. I'm going to go to the next one. Now, these are the ASEAN nations. And you can see that they sort of are there south of China, but some of these countries are threatened by Chinese expansion. For instance, after the Vietnam War was over, just a few years, there was a very sharp border clash between the Vietnamese and the Chinese. The Chinese have tried to seize control of many of the islands and small little islets in the South China Sea, and some of these conflict with claims of Vietnam over these islands, the Philippines over these islands, the Japanese over some of these islands, and it creates a considerable difficulty. And finally, even the United States in the Americas had the Rio Treaty, which included almost all the Latin American countries and the United States it wasn't a full kind of defense treaty, but it was one where these countries agreed to cooperate. And the United States saw it as a vehicle to keep out communism, if possible. So, from the Soviet point of view, they're surrounded. Now, the time frame for my thing, I might find one other group of nations called the Nonaligned Nations. Those nations that were caught between the United States and its alliances and the Russians and their alliances and interests. Some of these are big countries like India. Another was Yugoslavia, a communist country, but which was targeted by Moscow to change the regime and get rid of Marshal Tito, who was too independent-minded for the Russians. Another big country was Indonesia, but there were dozens and dozens of countries that joined the non-aligned movement, and they would periodically have conferences to try to establish their independence vis-a-vis both of these blocs that were always giving them pressure. We'll give you economic aid, we'll give you military aid, we'll give you diplomatic support if you side with us against the Soviets, or vice versa. So the Soviets tried the same sort of thing. Now, we were a richer country than the Russians, and just in terms of economic and military aid, we could probably outbid the Russians if we wanted. But occasionally, we found their price too high because these non-aligned countries, if they were smart, found, we can bargain here. And sometimes they would bargain very well, and we would be paying far more than probably we should have been to try to win their support. And their support was never total. They weren't ready to sign an alliance with us, or necessarily with the Russians, with their regime. Well, when Stalin died in 1953, there was a period of 2 years in which there was a changeover of leadership. One of the very first things they did was to execute the head of the secret police, Lavrentiy Beria. The top people in the Communist Party thought, we got to get rid of this guy. He is too powerful and untrustworthy. And then it became a contest between Malenkov and Khrushchev. But Khrushchev was the party secretary at the time. That was the post that Stalin had when he first competed with Trotsky. And the value of being party secretary is you're in charge of making appointments to people to different positions within the government and the party. And the result is you can place your supporters in the key spots. And Khrushchev did this. And so within 2 years, Malenkov was ousted. He was given a ceremonial post and really kicked out of power. And Khrushchev more or less took over, and Khrushchev was there from 1955 to 1964. And he did many positive things, but then he also had, of course, some negatives. I'll still first talk a little bit about the positive things which helped to make the Soviet Union a better place. One of them is he reduced the power of the secret police dramatically. He opened the country to more foreign visitors so that people could have a little bit more of an appreciation. It's still a closed society. It's still not really open, but it was far more open than it was. He encouraged artistic expression, especially the writing of poetry and so forth. And they were more, you could write more without getting into deep trouble. Now, you couldn't write everything. And certainly some writers were arrested and sent off to Siberia for long periods of time for writing stuff that was hostile to the regime. good example would be Alex Solzhenitsyn, who eventually is forced to leave in exile and came to America. But he pushed science and was head of the Soviet Union when Sputnik went up. And Sputnik went up in 1957 and shocked the Americans. We realized, my God, we're behind in the space race. We've got to catch up. And we spent a lot of money to try to do that. And it was unclear for a while that we were going to be able to catch up. Shortly afterwards, the Soviets sent a rocket that hit the moon. We didn't have any rockets that could do that at the time. And then in 1961, Yuri Gagarin was the first man to walk in space. And he was a Soviet. So within 4 short years, the Soviet Union did 3 things in their space program that really shocked us and surprised us. He also began to push peaceful coexistence and competition. Now, he would still sometimes be very threatening, and one of the most famous incidents was when he went to the UN to give a speech, and he took off his shoe and he wrapped the table with his shoe and used rather vulgar language and so forth. One of the positive things from an American point of view was in 1956, in February, he gave, this was a secret speech to the top Soviet leaders called a Desalinization Speech. He attacked Stalin and Stalin's policies and Stalin's methods in very blunt terms. And it was a secret speech, but somehow the US State Department got a hold of it and published it in entirety in June of the same year. And when the United States did this and people realized that this was Khrushchev's real ideas on Stalin, and they exposed so many of Stalin's crimes, they were aghast, especially leaders of the various communist parties, even in the satellite states. What are you doing here? Washing all of our dirty linen in front of the capitalist bloc. This is awful. Well, the people who were most offended were the Chinese. Mao Zedong had no particular great love for Stalin. He met him only once in 1949, but he was shocked and angry that they had sort of made fun of this communist hero who had long led the communist bloc. And he began to sort of compete then with this new guy, Khrushchev. He didn't know what he was doing. And the result of it was a gradual separation between the Chinese and the Soviets. Before, the Chinese worked hand in hand with the Soviets in many ways. So this created a huge gap. Another was, shortly thereafter, troubles in Poland and Hungary. I mean, they took note of the Desalinization Speech. There were demonstrations and riots. Polish authorities were able to crush this attempt to change the system in Poland without Russian help, but the Russians were threatening to intervene. In Hungary, they were less successful because the leader of this reform movement was in charge of the government, a man by the name of Jonas Kader. And the result was eventually the Russians and other Warsaw Pact nations sent troops in to crush. Some 2,500 Hungarians were killed, 13,000 were wounded, and tens of thousands fled to the United States. So this was a huge thing. And the Chinese, although they urged the Soviet Union to crush these attempts to change the system in Poland and Hungary, nonetheless said to basically Khrushchev, you brought this on yourself. You're the cause of this with your attack on Stalin. Another was the summit was going to be set up with the United States, and Khrushchev really wanted to visit the United States. It was going to be with Eisenhower. And shortly before the summit, the Soviets shot down an American spy plane, the U-2 spy plane, and captured the pilot. And although Eisenhower initially declined to agree that it was a spy plane, ultimately he was forced to concede that it was. And in fact, it was going to be the last flight of the U-2 plane because we now had spy satellites and we weren't going to need the U-2 anymore. So it was ironic that they send up this sort of maybe last flight, be shot down. And the summit was called off. And relations with the United States that had been improving now sort of took a step back. And finally, the Berlin Wall went up. It went, well, not finally. It goes up the night of August 12th, 1961. First, it's just barbed wire, but later on they realized, oh, that's not enough. And they created a concrete wall that was 12 feet high and almost 100 miles long to try to surround West Berlin and to prevent anybody from crossing into West Berlin from East Germany. Why did they do this? From 1945 to 1961, it's estimated that 2,700,000 East Germans fled through Berlin to the West. I mean, 2.7 million. It's incredible. And they were losing, you know, the best of the people, the most educated, the most progressive people, the most hardworking people were fleeing. And Germany's population in East Germany declined during that same period of time from 19 million to 17 million. So they're losing population. Well, Anastas Mikoyan, who was the second deputy premier, spoke to the East Germans shortly before the wall went up. And he said, our Marxist-Leninist theory must prove itself in the German Democratic Republic. It must be demonstrated that what the capitalists and the renegades, these 2.7 million that are fleeing, say is wrong. Marx was born in Germany. If socialism does not win in the GDR, if communism does not prove itself superior and vital here, then we have not won. The issue is this fundamental with us. It was crucial. And they realized that the wall was going to be a terrible propaganda deficit. And it was throughout its whole existence, because there were all kinds of guard towers, dogs roaming along the wall to prevent people from fleeing, mines, and guards were given the orders to shoot to kill if people tried to cross the wall. And a number of people were killed. Following this was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which was not a total defeat for the Russians. I mean, they were forced to back off, looked embarrassing, but secretly Kennedy agreed to pull missiles out of Turkey. So it was kind of like a mutual transfer. But that fear of nuclear war not changed, let's say, scared not only us, but it scared Russian leaders as well. And finally, there was the break with China. That got worse and worse. In 1960, when Khrushchev is still in charge, the Soviet technicians and advisors were brought home from China. They were helping China to industrialize and modernize their economy. And when they came, they brought with them the blueprints of most of the factories that they had built and most of the machines that they had sent to China. So they were really leaving China in a lurch. So the Chinese were, of course, furious. In October of 1964, Khrushchev was called back to Moscow from vacation in Georgia, the Georgia Republic of the Soviet Union, our Georgia. He's brought back and then told he's going to resign. And he said, could anyone have dreamed of telling Stalin that he did not suit us anymore and suggesting he retire? Not even a wet spot would have remained where we had been standing. Now everything is different. The fear is gone, and we can talk as equals. This is my contribution. I'm glad that the party has gotten to the point that it can even rein in its first secretary. You smeared me all over with shit, and I say you're right. I mean, typical Khrushchev to get crude, but well, he was replaced first. It was a little bit uncertain who was going to be replacing him, but ultimately it was Leonid Brezhnev. And Brezhnev was basically in charge for about 18 years, but he ran a different kind of approach. It was much more collegial than Khrushchev, and he was willing to share power, not the top position, but with other Soviet leaders like Alexis Kosygin, who was mainly in charge of the economy, Mikhail Suslov, who was concerned with propaganda and ideology, and Podgorny. These were other members of the Politburo, but he was willing to share this kind of power and was not seen as a threat, but rather as a person who could be dealt with other powerful Soviet leaders. This did not mean, though, that he was a big friend of the West. Russia remained very much a kind of closed society. But he was also, had been scared by Khrushchev and that nuclear crisis. And so he favored cooperation and detente with the United States and the other Western powers. We will try to work out various kinds of agreements so that we no longer threaten each other so much. So one of the things that he did was sign military agreements. So Nixon went to Russia in 1971, and while there, he signed 7 different agreements with the Russians. The most important was the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. But there were others that would increase trade with the Soviet Union, which would ease various other differences we had. So that this was you can't say that it was a totally negative kind of experience. Let's see. He also went to the United States and had a good trip here, so that he had some sense of what kind of country we were. He also signed an anti-ballistic missile treaty and nuclear non-proliferation treaty. So there were ways in which we were at least working with the Russians. Now, he was a kind of gray eminence. People didn't warm up to him. He wasn't colorful like Khrushchev. But he also did some other things that were less positive from our point of view. One was he cracked down on liberalist reforms in Czechoslovakia in 1968. This was similar to what happened in Hungary. They had an election, a reforming communists came in who wanted to have openings with the West and to create a more open kind of society. And ultimately, he said, no, this can't happen. And so he sent in troops and crushed this attempt at liberalization. This attack, after all the time that Khrushchev had tried to work to open up more, and even Brezhnev had opened up the Soviet bloc more, scared and angered the various satellite leaders. So they were very upset with him and were critical of his decision to send in these troops. But it appeared he got past that. However, in the very next year, warfare broke out between China and the USSR in 1969. And these were not small conflicts, but involved tens of thousands of troops, both sides arming. And the Soviets were very, very concerned, partly because Siberia is not well populated. And across the border was not then 1 billion people, but getting close to 1 billion people who might overwhelm the whole eastern part of the Soviet Union. And when Almeric, I talked about him in the very beginning, will the Soviet Union survive to 1984? Well, he's writing, he published this book in 1970, right after these attacks. And so you might say, well, it's coincidence with that, or no. He's looking at what happened, and he felt that the Soviet Union would fall for two reasons. One is internal problems, when there were plenty by Brezhnev's time. And secondly, war with China, that the Soviet Union would lose. If we think about the Soviet Union, by the end of Brezhnev's term, in 1982, he died. And then it came time to get a new person. And I was teaching at the college, and I got a call from our development officer saying, oh, somebody in the newspaper wants to talk to you about who's going to be the new Soviet leader. And I said, well, I'm not a Soviet expert, but I'll do a little quick research and try to find some kind of answer. So I ran over to the library and I looked at things as fast as I could. And I found out that there were a number of favorites, but one of the favorites was Mikhail Gorbachev. Another one was number 2 guy in the Kremlin, Konstantin Chernenko, a much older guy. And the third one was Yuri Andropov, who had been the head of the KGB. And I said, well, I don't think it's going to be Gorbachev. He's too young and too charismatic. But I don't think it's going to be Andropov either. He was the KGB guy, and you know what happened to Beria? These guys remember. He could be dangerous. Well, who did they choose? Andropov. So I thought, man, you know, I really blew it there. Andropov only lasted a little more than a year before he died. And then it came time to have a replacement, and my development officer called me up again and said, Joe, the press wants to know who's going to replace Andropov. So I thought, well, the most favorite was Gorbachev. And I said, nah, it's not going to be Gorbachev. But I didn't think it was going to be Chernenko either. So I chose somebody else, and it was Chernenko. And he lasted less than a year. And finally, they came a third time. And I said, well, you know, they passed over Gorbachev twice. It's got to be somebody else. And I think I named somebody, but I was wrong again. After that, they stopped calling me. They learned their lesson. Well, that looks to the Soviets, and they would continue as supporters of armed rebellion in various places where they conflicted with us. So in Africa, they were supportive of the Marxist revolution that occurred in Ethiopia that had followed the killing of Haile Selassie. And that regime didn't fortunately last real long, but it did a lot of damage. They also supported revolutionary movements in Angola and Mozambique in the 1970s, which were Portuguese territories, and the Portuguese were reluctant to give up their colonies. And various factions were fighting them. The United States supported a man by the name of Jonas Savimbi, as did the South Africans, and he was in competition with a Marxist group in Angola. And the war was long and bitter. Ultimately, Savimbi was killed in the fighting, and his movement ultimately decided to make peace and to try to turn to politics to compete with the Marxists there. In Mozambique, there was a similar struggle going on. It wasn't as long or as devastating, but it was still costly. And ultimately, of course, the Portuguese left. In Central America and the Caribbean, the Soviets, of course, supported the Cubans. They also supported Nicaragua and its leftist regime after the Somoza dictatorship fell. They supported El Salvador, Marxist. And of course, after Brezhnev, and in modern times, there are even more leftist regimes now in Central and South America. In 1979, Brezhnev ordered the invasion of Afghanistan. A pro-Soviet Communist Party in Afghanistan carried out a coup that overthrew the government, and they were in Kabul, but once they were there, they found out we don't control most of the countryside. All these rebel movements are causing us trouble, and the Soviets said, we'll support you. They sent in tens of thousands of troops, and it cost them a lot of men and treasure. And finally, the Soviets said, we're out of here. And after they left, the Marxist regime fell almost right away. Shades of what happened to us, only we stayed much longer. So wherever there was a chance of expanding influence, Brezhnev was, especially at the detriment of the United States, Brezhnev was encouraging that. So he was not really a friend of the United States. I'm going to now turn to the other main area of the thing, and I've got about 6 or 7 minutes because I decided I'm not really going to be doing what I did the last time and forget my time. But that's East Asia. And East Asia is a very hot spot right now. But it goes back, and I'll look only at 4 countries quickly: China, Korea, and Indochina. And we've talked a lot about Indochina, so maybe I'll leave off that, except to say that one of the most decisive events that occurred that, let's say, led America to ultimately reevaluate our presence in Vietnam was the Tet Offensive in January of 1968. There, the Viet Minh, the communist forces, made a major effort to seize control of a number of important cities in South Vietnam. Now, ultimately, militarily, it was a tremendous defeat of the communists. They lost lots and lots of men, and they failed to overthrow the South Vietnamese government. But the attack was so shocking to American press and to the American military, but especially the press, who had been told that we are winning this war and there's, we're going to really contain the communists. Well, what have you done? You haven't contained them at all. They had this huge attack. Well, this is January 1968. In that same month, the North Koreans carried out 2 actions that showed that they were also a danger to American interest. One of them was to send 31 commandos, especially highly trained North Koreans, across the DMZ to attack the Blue House. The Blue House was the presidential mansion of the South Korean president, then Chung-hee Park, who had just been reelected as president, but he was pretty much a dictator, a very authoritarian figure anyway. He still had elections, but he made sure that the elections went his way. But he was a very, in many ways, progressive kind of dictator, because Korea's economy really began to take off. And the Koreans were creating a very modernized industrial economy. And Koreans were living better and better, the South Koreans. Well, they got within sight of the Blue House before they were eventually stopped. Ultimately, all 30 out of 31 were killed in the attack and in the mop-up of them afterwards. But so were 26 South Korean troops and 4 Americans. And a number of other South Koreans were badly wounded in the fighting that took place when they got close. I guess they got within about 100 yards of the Blue House, and they were stopped by a South Korean policeman, the chief of police, and he started questioning them because they were dressed in South Korean military uniforms. And they had been walking down the main street just like they were part of a movement of troops. But he became suspicious from their answers, and he pulled his pistol. And ultimately a fight broke out. He killed one guy, but they killed him, his chief assistant. But then other South Korean troops, closed in, and they had to flee for their lives. They were largely caught. That occurs in 1968. Well, in 1969, we have the Chinese and the Soviets doing a border fight. So all of these things occurring at around the same time. 1968 is also the time of the Czechoslovakia liberalization effort and its crushing. It's a time of student rebellion in the United States, and the Vietnam War, in France, in a lot of other Western countries. So 1968 was, in a way, a very bad year. A lot of bad things happened. Well, one of the things that I wanted to mention was that from my reading of some sources, Stalin, Mao, and Kim Il-sung, the first Kim, there's been 3 of them now, conspired in 1950 to launch the Korean War. And they did it because on January 12th, 1950, Dean Acheson, who was then head of the State Department, gave an important speech, public speech, in which he talked about what is the American defense perimeter in Asia. And he mentioned Japan, he mentioned the Philippines, and he did not mention Korea or Taiwan. So they were outside of this defensive settlement in the mind of the Secretary of State. And the Chinese and the Koreans thought, maybe this is an ideal time to take over these properties. And Kim promised, I can do this in just a matter of days. And of course, he almost succeeded because the South Koreans and the American troops that were there were pushed back to the area just around Busan. And the Americans, I think, were mixed about whether it was worthwhile trying to save South Korea, but ultimately Truman decided we've got to intervene, and he went to the UN and got UN authorization. And Douglas MacArthur then moved the troops, most of the troops from Japan to carry out the Incheon landing and reverse the flow. And then, of course, the war lasted from 1950 to 1953, and it wasn't until after Stalin died that the Chinese and the North Koreans made an armistice. They wanted to make an armistice quicker, but Stalin wanted to keep them fighting. But the Chinese paid very heavily. And one estimate that I read, John Lewis Gaddis, who's written this wonderful book on the Cold War, estimates that 600,000 Chinese were killed in Korea. We lost 35,000 plus men. Gaddis says more than 2 million Koreans died in this attempt of the communists to militarily spread communism to the south and take over that country. So one of the 600,000 of the Chinese was Mao Zedong's, one of his sons was killed in the fighting. Well, the Chinese were, in fact, not all that aggressive, but they did on Taiwan. And in the 1950s, twice this was after the Korean War was over, they threatened, this was still during Eisenhower's time, Taiwan, and they threatened it by seizing control of 2 islands that are island chains that belong to Taiwan, or kept by Taiwan, along the Chinese coast, the Quemoy and Matsu. And they really are not very big islands, are not very valuable. And I think the nationalist Chinese that controlled Taiwan would have been smarter to have pulled out of these islands much earlier, maybe in 1949. But Chiang Kai-shek always hoped that there'd be a day that he could go back. And so they kept him, and they began to shell these islands and threaten them with invasion. And first in 1953-54, then again in 1958. And I remember Eisenhower sitting in the Oval Office and going on public television, warning the Chinese, do not try to invade or take these islands or the United States will respond. We had then also had a defense treaty with Taiwan. So if Taiwan was attacked, we would intervene on their behalf. The Chinese were not ready for anything at that moment. And so they backed off. Although they continued to occasionally shell these islands, they essentially told the authorities when they were going to shell these places. I see I'm past my time already. I'll try to wrap things up real quick. So the Chinese, are expansive now. They have built a huge navy. They have a huge military. They're pushing out into these islands. They have a very strong economy. Although that economy is, although very strong, is partly held hostage to advanced countries like the United States, because if we would suddenly stop buying Chinese products or move the production of a lot of goods that end up in the United States and Western Europe, that economy would collapse, I think. And the Chinese have become used to now becoming, at least having a shot at becoming middle-class people. And this might be devastating to the Chinese. So maybe they'll be cautious. I hope so. Anyway, thanks for listening. And do you have any questions? Yes?
Why did they kick out Khrushchev?
Well, they had all kinds of reasons. One was his virgin lands policy of opening up lots of lands to agricultural production, which was sort of like the Dust Bowl for us. You open up lands that are marginal, and if you get a bad weather year, you get bad Dust Bowls and you get failed crops. Another was that the Cuban Missile Crisis really scared him. They found him rude and arrogant and kind of a loose cannon, and they were worried about that. So I think they finally felt, we've had this guy around and he's becoming a megalomaniac. He's getting too powerful. The fact that he went so gracefully into retirement, he ended up writing his memoirs and had this kind of comment means I think maybe they misjudged him, that he was not quite the terrible person that he was. That's the best answer I think I can get. Yeah.
In view of the situation in Eastern Europe now, Ukraine, the Russians parked on the border, threatening them to invade, and our concern about dealing with this situation successfully. Would you say that the concept of spheres of influence for certain powerful nations is likely to become stronger and resume its importance and practicality? Predict the future for us, Joe.
Remember what I did with these Soviet presidents now. I think that what the best solution would be to diplomatically meet some of the Russian demands, not all of them, where they could say that we have real security, that the Ukrainians will not become a real threat. I mean, the Russians have a good case for being angry about Ukraine because they had a pro-Soviet government in charge. There was an election which we interfered with, we intervened in, called the Orange Revolution, and we helped finance the opponents of the Soviet regime. So I found it really, in a way, amusing in our 1916 election when we were accusing the Russians of interfering in our election. I thought, yeah, we've done that on many occasions in other countries, by giving assistance and so forth. And even the previous Obama administration, he sent advisors and so forth to help the Israeli opposition to get rid of Netanyahu. And this was like a year ahead of the 1916 election, and we're complaining that now somebody's interfering with us.
You mean 2016?
2016, yes. Did I say 1916? I'm hopeless. But I think the best thing would be to try to find some way to satisfy at least the Russian sense of insecurity. But I'm not sure that's possible with Putin, because he dreams of recreating and reconquering many of the areas that were lost when the Soviet Union disintegrated. Even if he can't get them under direct control, he wants to make sure that very favorable governments would be there. And these governments will be certainly not those that will be respect of the kind of values and goals that we hope to see there. But you're right. I mean, the Russians have legitimate concerns, and we ought to be sensitive enough to those concerns to make compromises with them when we can, and to try to find ways to encourage the Russians to sort of join. When they joined, the economic bloc, we were hopeful that that would be satisfactory. But we also tried to expand NATO to much of the Eastern Bloc, and I think this, from the Russian point of view, was very threatening to us, to them, not to us.
So that sounds like you're saying that the sphere of influence concept has some more legitimacy than we have given expected.
Yes, it does. Right. Yes.
Can you, in the context of all this, explain what's going on in Kazakhstan?
I can't really. I've read a little bit in the newspapers about the troubles there and the Soviets intervening with troops. I mean, they're concerned with Kazakhstan is a big place, and they're concerned with their border. And I don't think they want to really directly control Kazakhstan again, because most of the people are Muslims, and they fought a very bitter, nasty war with this tiny little territory called Chechnya.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that was something that made them aware we do not want to get involved in an Islamic kind of contest within our own country. They crushed the Chechen rebels, but the Chechens are not satisfied. They're going to create
They're
trouble
also
down
crazy.
there. They're crazy.
They're not crazy.
Maybe so. I certainly wouldn't want to take on the big Russian bear myself.
Someone on one of the news programs today was commenting that there is a huge Russian population in northern Kazakhstan that might make that part of the country attractive.
It's possible, they seized part of Georgia for that reason. They seized and are taking part of the Ukraine, where there's a large Russian population. But, the Russians tried to settle Russians in all of these satellite states, especially the Baltic states. And so there's a Russian minority there, and you can always say, oh, our minority is being mistreated. We've got to intervene. And if countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are small enough that rapid intervention could mean that they lose their independence again. Did you have a question?
Yeah. What's happened to Bing William Monsoon?
Pardon?
What's happened to the two islands in William Monsoon?
They are still under Taiwan's control. Yeah. It wouldn't take the Chinese any time at all to take them over.
That was a major issue in 1960, that election. We haven't heard about it since.
Yeah. I think the Chinese felt this was just an irritant that we had. But since they now want Taiwan in a very serious way, and I'm very worried about Taiwan.
You know one reason they won't do it? TSMC is the premier manufacturer of chips.
Yes.
And it'll be a smoky ruin if China takes Taiwan.
Yeah.
And the world economy will be screwed.
Yes.
So institutions that hurt more than us. Oh, it's everybody. The world depends on how the chips come out of that factory. Intel doesn't make chips. It doesn't make 5 million chips.
The other factor is if they would take Taiwan, I would predict that the Japanese would rearm and would move to nuclear weapons.
They're probably about a couple range turns away from it.
They have technology that they could be there in no time at all. But
And there's a big economy between Taiwan and China, even though you think they're separate, there's a big economy between these two.
oh yeah, there is. Yeah. So Taiwan would be important, but
We're not going to defend Taiwan.
no, we're not going to go in there with weapons. And I don't think the Taiwanese, they're a country of 16 million people, which is small in the world sense, but it's small compared to 1.2 billion.
It's kind of a hard place to take though militarily. Its beaches aren't real good. You could like do a lot of things with shoots, with artillery. I'm sure they've been stocking out.
Lots of mountains.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's not D-Day on the shores of France.
No, no, you're right there. It could be a very costly
Yes, it could.
endeavor. And if we arm them well, the Chinese might say it's not worth
Well, that's what we should do. We should give them diesel subs, our best artillery, our best jets, and say, how nice.
And we've already not done that because we don't want to make China mad. We've already not hit Taiwan everything we should have, could.
Yeah.
Yes.
No. Well,
Thank
thank you very much. I wasn't as bad as the last time.
you. You were fine.